Marking the halfway point in this series checking out the current state of entry-level laptops, today's victim is the MSI Modern 15, which in this configuration includes a 15-inch IPS-like but not IPS for legal reasons 1080p display, AMD Ryzen 5 7530U, and a rather generous 16GB of RAM. Design-wise, you're looking at a big, heavy black plastic slab of a 15-inch laptop with ports on the left and right, cooling intake and speaker grills on the bottom, and unfortunately, this one is infected with stupid lifty hinge disease, making it extremely uncomfortable for laptop use. Also, the hinge is garbage, but we'll come back to that. Dimensions are sort of enormous given the light-duty sort of machine this is, and it's decidedly heavy for this class of laptop too, weighing in at over 2.2 kilograms including the power brick. I haven't quite found the part that's modern yet, so let me know if you spot it somewhere. Included in the box is a laptop itself, a compact 65-watt power brick, a quick start guide and warranty information, and way too much single-use plastic. Yuck. From new, there weren't too many quality control issues on this one, the most obvious being a hinge that clacks loudly and a Wi-Fi antenna that wasn't seated and stuck on correctly. I fixed this up, but I shouldn't have to be finishing MSI's job for them in one way or another every time. Connectivity is bizarre on this one. There's HDMI 2.1 and a high-speed USB Type-C with power delivery, but a full 2 of the 3 USB Type-A ports are the 20-year-old USB 2.0. What? None of the ports on the left-hand side are modular, but the right-hand side USB Type-A ports and the microSD card reader are all mounted on a replaceable daughter board, so if you're going to be clumsy and break ports, make it these ones. Input devices are a mixed blessing. Despite being large, accurate, and with a reassuringly positive click mechanism, the trackpad is a total disappointment for one reason. It rattles like an absolute bastard, all the time. On the flip side, MSI's backlit keyboard is, as always, absolutely fantastic. Key travel, actuation force, and feedback are all just about perfect. Lighting is even, and the keyboard is very firmly fixed to a solid-feeling palm rest assembly which is totally free of any rattling or excessive give when pressed. The number pad is squished to an annoying extent, which is borderline unforgivable for some people, but the rest of the keyboard is spot on. Helping give the keyboard its very solid feel, inside and underneath we find quite a lot of bracing to stop the cheap soft plastic from feeling too squishy. A metal plate extends over almost the entire underside of the keyboard deck and a solid L-shaped brace runs along the center. It's not the most rigid setup in the world, but it's definitely not bad. The lid requires 809 grams of force to open from fully closed, which is reasonably low given the weight of the laptop, so it's easy to open with one hand. Guess what though? Almost all of that, 700 grams worth, is the weight of the display assembly itself, so what's the hinge doing exactly? Well, you saw the intro, so you can guess how this is going to go. Moving the display from 90 degrees, there's an initial spike to an already low 437 grams when the stupid little lid foot starts elevating the main chassis. From there, hinge resistant takes a dive and fast. From 120 degrees, it takes an alarmingly low 206 gram nudge to move the display, and from 140 degrees, it takes only 107 grams. So from there onwards, a sneeze or a stiff breeze is all it takes for the screen to fall over. Clearly these hinges are wound up nowhere near as tight as they need to be, and that can only mean one thing, so let's go have a look inside. And predictably enough, there it is. These lower hinge brackets that bolt into the keyboard deck need to be braced as far as possible into the deck area to spread the load they're subjected to out over a wide area. This is far too narrow and it relies on these pathetic little screw bosses propped up by skinny soft plastic scaffolding, which will rapidly fatigue from the concentrated force applied to them every time you open, adjust, or even just bump the display. That alone is an obvious failure point, and we haven't even looked inside the display assembly yet. Well, stop me if you've seen this before. The skinny and narrow hinge brackets extend no more than 15mm into the lid, do not have full height brackets fixed to or interlocking with them, and are bolted into tiny thin plastic standoffs with small shallow screws. So the answer to why the hinges are so loose is to stop them breaking too quickly. Textbook planned obsolescence. Mounted in that doomed and floppy lid assembly is an almost acceptable but unexciting LCD display. There are a few positives here. Contrast is decent for an LCD, color uniformity is good, and viewing angles are excellent. Unfortunately, maximum brightness is too low and it doesn't even cover the basic sRGB color gamut, so even web content is presented in a washed out and inaccurate way. 300 nits of brightness and more than 90% of the sRGB gamut are realistically the minimum that you should accept, so while this display gets close on some metrics, it still doesn't quite hit the mark. Mounted above the display is a usual grainy webcam and stereo microphones capable of capturing acceptable quality footage of your ceiling when the lid falls open. The sound system installed in the Modern 15 is the typical arrangement with 2 stereo speakers firing downward at the sides of the base plate. Speaker drivers themselves are the usual crappy little oval units mounted in reasonably sized and shock-mounted housings, and they're driven by the tiny and basic Realtek ALC 256. Audio performance is bleak. It's far too quiet and far too tinny. This is actually the worst internal sound system I've encountered in a long time. The included storage is a Kingston PCIe 4.0 SSD using a single-core Phison controller with no DRAM and 4 chips of Kingston's own TLC NAND flash. Sustained read and write speeds are decent on this one, although once again we've got a PCIe 4 SSD mounted in a system that only supports PCIe 3 speeds. Wireless connectivity is provided by a MediaTek chip which supports dual-band Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. MSI have unfortunately not yet integrated power and cooling profiles with the operating system, so you're stuck using MSI Center to adjust power modes. It's worth noting that on this particular machine, the gulf in power delivery between modes is enormous, with the CPU running at 33% higher wattage on high performance than it does on balanced. Battery charging is also configurable in MSI Center with a pretty good array of different settings to choose from. Other than MSI Center, there's basically no crapware pre-installed on this one. MSI used to be the worst for software bloat, and now they're one of the best. At idle, in balanced mode, while plugged in, as measured from the power outlet, the machine uses around 10 watts of power, and when running flat out with the CPU fully loaded up in high performance mode, this increases to about 50 watts. Extremely heavy power consumption for the performance level, that's for sure, but it's still low in the grand scheme of things. The 38 watt hour battery fitted to this unit is reporting around 36.5 watt hours after calibrating over a few charge cycles. This will gradually drop with use. With the display set to its low maximum brightness and sitting idle on the Windows desktop, the modern 15 managed a very low 6 hours and 9 minutes of runtime. During my usual heavy internet test, it quit after only 4.5 hours. Impressively unimpressive. Charging from empty, the battery takes 41 minutes to hit 50%, 1 hour 13 minutes to hit 80%, and it's full after 2 hours and 8 minutes. When it does finally wear out, that battery is reasonably easy to replace. Aggressive and fragile plastic clips and one factory seal sticker anyway, but after that, it's only held in with 4 screws and no adhesive. The very good-looking processor included here is AMD's Ryzen 5 7530U. Joining the current trend of misleadingly named chips, this CPU is most similar to the old Ryzen 5 5600U, being manufactured on TSMC's older 7nm process and based on Zen 3 architecture. Power is provided by a very neatly arranged VRM. In fact, have you noticed something? Everything on this board is neatly arranged. It's kind of beautiful. Forming part of the visually appealing board topology is the unfortunately soldered-on system memory. Mounted to both sides of the board are 2 channels of 4 Samsung DDR4 3200 memory modules. 16GB of RAM is more than enough for this sort of processor, so while it sucks that MSI have resorted to soldered RAM, it's not the end of the world. The integrated GPU is the very familiar and rapidly aging Radeon RX Vega 7. This GPU pales in comparison with modern high-performance integrated graphics, but it's still supported by AMD's Adrenalin drivers and does have basic support for DirectX 12. The system tasked with extracting heat from the CPU is quite a bit beefier than the setups in the other low-end laptops we've looked at recently, but it's fundamentally still a one fan, one heatsink arrangement, breathing entirely from the bottom of the laptop and exhausting through the hinge. Well, trying to. The exhaust outlet is smashed right up against the lower display bezel, severely restricting airflow. There is a way to do this well, but this isn't it. A very large copper cold plate extends out to cover all VRM components and uses 4 screws to ensure even contact pressure. The CPU die contact patch shows some very light machining marks, but it's generally free of any factory-induced scuffs or pitting. Without the fan, the cooler weighs 48 grams. More weight means more thermal mass, which means less reliance on the fans to dissipate small spikes in heat from brief workloads, at least in theory. In the modern 15's case, the fan gets rowdy annoyingly often, seemingly every time the CPU kicks up to full power, even for a moment. Overall noise emissions are similar to a cheaper gaming laptop, but with none of the accompanying performance. As always, we'll need to be mildly abusive to that cooling system to find out what it can handle. Kicking things off, I've subjected it to a 30-minute stress test running Cinebench R23 on a loop while the laptop sits flat on a desk in its highest performance mode. Since there's no separate GPU, I haven't run a GPU test at the same time, so 100% of the power budget will be aimed at those processor cores. Package power starts off blasting up to nearly 50 watts before dropping to and maintaining 30 for the remainder of the test. Core temperatures gradually waft upward for a while before stabilizing at a completely reasonable but completely arbitrary 87 degrees. All perfectly under control in these conditions, but I suspect that there's not too much overhead in this cooler to cope with a hot day. 30 watts is quite generous for this CPU, so all 6 cores hold on to about 3.5 GHz for the duration of this test. That's not too bad for a 6-core chip. Unfortunately, the waste heat this laptop generates under this sort of load is not handled in an acceptable manner. Skin temperatures are absolutely appalling on this one, with the keyboard sailing well into the mid-40s over a very wide area above the back of the motherboard. Things are no better on the bottom case, with the plastics hitting as high as 60 degrees. This is a clear sign that the cooler is managing to get heat off the CPU die, but not managing to get it out of the case. In short, the exhaust vent design is exactly as bad as it looks. With all this power consumption and heat comes completely unimpressive, if still adequate performance. Despite being given a black eye by Fanless Fruit Company produce from 4 years ago, this one is at least the fastest of this batch of low-end machines, and by a huge margin in most cases. You won't be surprised at all to learn that in normal general use, this laptop is always fast enough and never feels overworked. Heavy multitasking with office and even music production software is absolutely no problem, and you'd only really start running into issues with software that's reliant on high GPU performance. It would be really nice if that fan would shut up though. Now, since we've got something resembling a usable amount of Vega compute units and something resembling a usable amount of RAM, you'd certainly be forgiven for expecting to be able to do at least some sort of gaming on this thing. Predictably enough, modern gaming benchmarks like 3D Mark's Firestrike and Time Spy look like absolute slideshows, but that Vega 7 still turns in some pretty good scores by the standards of integrated graphics. Dialing our expectations down a significant amount, the modern 15 easily keeps the almost 10-year-old Dying Light above 60 FPS almost non-stop. Hallelujah. Mind you, that is with the graphics settings dropped all the way down and at 720p resolution. Still, hooray. This motivated me to try something newer, but unfortunately in catgame.exe, with the graphics similarly dropped all the way down and the resolution set to 720p, things are getting a bit ropey. In outdoor areas, it struggles to keep the frame rate above 30, but since it does for the most part, I'd still call this game just about playable. In short though, if you're sticking to older or less graphically challenging games and have some tolerance for the odd low frame rate, the Vega 7 still has a bit of life left in it. The laptop itself though, no. Suffering through the floppy hinge, bad speakers, fan noise, and the high skin temperatures just to play games at this level of performance is nothing short of masochism. Overall, it should come as no surprise that despite relatively good performance and an excellent keyboard, I won't be recommending this laptop to anybody. Design compromises are rampant in this one, but I won't even dwell on the bad thermal management, sloppy trackpad, or poor audio. It's that Hinge that completely writes this off as an acceptable product. Given the seemingly engineered-in expiry date on the most important structural components, I'm giving this one an official rating of Nuclear Notebook certified time bomb, and we are leaving yet another MSI laptop review on a sour note. Boo.